So I will rethink this Vietnam thing. Maybe it wasn't such a great idea. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Um. So wait. Oh, Marshall McLuhan.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you're a Marshall McLuhan. By the way, do you know about this guy named Innis, who is actually McLuhan's inspiration? Innis.
Mm-mm.
Behind every acknowledged great thinker, there's an unacknowledged great thinker, and some of McLuhan's ideas came. I think it was Harold, Innis. Maybe I should Google it, but the
Let me write that down.
uh, I've always the thing that Harold Innis definitely has in common with Marshall McLuhan. Um, yeah, Canadian professor of political economy, had communication theories. He's the guy. What he has in common is I have trouble understanding both of them. B, to the extent that I can understand them, I think I disagree. Uh, the thing go ahead and but you're more of a McLuhan fan, so how do you want to invoke him at this particular point?
So this is gonna be. I have to ask you to like bear with me because it's difficult for me to articulate and even think through. But I think it's worth trying. And as a preface, I want to say, like, there's a reason you have troubles understanding McLuhan. I think it actually relates to Peterson too, in a weird way. I think Peterson and McLuhan have this thing in common that I see in them. I think, so McLuhan had this popular slogan: "The medium is the message." That is usually applied to, and the way he used it is applied to technology. Like, if you compare two societies or two people, and one watches television and the other reads books, that is the more important difference than what exactly they're watching on television or which books exactly they're reading. The medium itself makes the difference. I think that phrase, the medium as a message, and that idea that the way of transmitting the message, the medium you use, is as or more important than the content of that message, I think is a broad one. You can apply it to do a bunch of different things. And you can apply it to McLuhan himself. If you read McLuhan, like, they call him a media theorist, but you're not reading like a scientific theory when you read McLuhan. There's a lot of play on words, there's a lot of jokes and puns and slogans and some pictures, and you're reading, essays by a James Joyce scholar. And I think that choice of language, he decided to use that kind of language, not purely because it's a stylistic choice, but because it's part of the message. And the message in this part of the message, I think, is, his ideas are not, you can say that what you want to get out of McLuhan is to try to understand the language he uses, to try to understand his way of thinking, and then you can use that to think about anything else. Then you can get that to come to any
Sounds
conclusions.
like I've got a long road to hoe before I understand McLuhan, but keep going.
This
is not getting easier.
Another argument for this perception of mine is he had these what was called 4 laws of media, and they were formulated as questions. You don't normally phrase laws as questions. The reason he phrased it that way is because, again, this is the point. It's a way of thinking about things that you can use to draw your own conclusions. So that's kind of my preface for this thesis that I want to put forth. Because I was not thinking.
Should I correct your pronunciation when you mispronounce an English word?
Yes, please.
That would be preface.
Preface. Thank you.
At least
So
it was the second time. In general, my rule will be: you can pronounce a given word wrong once, but when you do it the second time, the full force of my authority rains down on your head.
That's perfect. So I was thinking about what I guess is called new media, podcasts and YouTube. And I was naturally using the kind of toolbox of McLuhan-esque thought to address that, because I think that it gives you like a big picture view of things. And well, let's see, where do I want to start? So you read that little thing that I wrote. If I wrote it today, and I probably will try to like rewrite it and do it differently, I would focus on something different there. My claim would be something like this. The nature of the new electric media that we have now, and for the purpose of this part of the conversation, we can focus on podcasting and YouTube. Just that medium by itself changes what kind of content would be influential in that domain, and changes the way people interact with information that they perceive through this. And all of this is the reason somebody like Peterson blew up, somebody like Rogan blew up. And Rogan in particular is using this media in the exact way that it's supposed to be used. Like the nature of the media, the podcasting and YouTube to a lesser degree, is better used the way he uses it, and Peterson as well, than when, like, let's say Ben Shapiro has a show on YouTube. It's not different from a TV show. It's like the format, two people sitting opposite to each other. It's an hour long.
They're very conventionally dressed, right? He's wearing a tie, isn't he?
I think, or at least he's wearing a suit at least. Yeah, and there are commercial breaks. This is the most frustrating fucking thing. Like, you're on YouTube, and he actually says, I only watched one episode with Rogan, but they talk for 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and then he says, and then I want to get into this or that, but first I want to make some money. So, and he turns to a camera and reads a copy, which is very different from how Rogan is doing it. And Rogan,
Rogan does a big ad at the beginning for like beef, right?
What?
Doesn't he do a big? When I've listened to him, I've only done it a couple of times, but it's like at the beginning he did a big ad for like beef, like steaks, like eat this beef, right?
Sure.
And
he records those separately, though.
This is like a serious demographic. I mean, like, what is his demographic like that makes steak sellers salivate? I mean, I guess it's like pretty middle American or something. But
he's moved. He has had some at the beginning of his career. I did not listen to him at that time, but I listened to all their episodes later. One of his big sponsors at the beginning of the podcasting career was a firm. It's called Fleshlight. They create like artificial vaginas for masturbation.
With this show,
the Joe Rogan Experience, yeah,
had ads for an artificial vagina.
Mm-hmm.
For men to masturbate with.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't this kind of inconsistent with his whole image? I mean, he's like a tough guy who shouldn't have trouble, getting a date, right?
Well, he's also married. I don't think he has trouble finding a date. But first and foremost, he's a stand-up comedian. An artificial vagina is inherently funny. And
so far I'm not laughing, but I'll give it some more thought.
Anyway, my point is, the ads. Actually, the way he did ads before and the way he's doing now is also kind of important. The way he's doing this now is they're recorded after the interview.
Wait a second. You mean there actually are artificial vaginas for people to masturbate with?
I don't know how big a market that is, but yeah, that definitely exists.
I'm not going to ask for details, but I'm full of curiosity. I mean, go ahead. Let's move on.
Apparently, some of them even resemble like space alien vaginas or something.
Well, now
or
you're
monster
talking.
Vaginas.
Why didn't you say that in the first place? Now I totally get it. Of course. I thought you meant human vaginas.
Yeah. Anyway, the ads, the way people do ads. If you compare the Ben Shapiro approach with this television just transported to YouTube, or the Joe Rogan approach, which is on YouTube, there are no ads. On podcasting, they're attached afterwards. You can fast forward through the first however minutes, and the conversation and the guest are not connected to that at all. His previous approach was kind of the opposite. They would start talking about who's the sponsor is, while the guest was in studio, but it would go on all kinds of weird tangents. It was not like I'll read the copy and then we get to the conversation. It's they could go for a half hour,
Now, are you telling me that the way Joe Rogan does it now, where he does a pre-recorded ad for steaks or something, and it shows up at the beginning, as opposed to the Ben Shapiro approach, where he stops mid-podcast, reads an ad, then you're telling me that Marshall McLuhan would say, whoa, these are radically different experiences? This really matters a whole lot? In terms of the influence the podcast has?
Yeah, well, let me explain why I think that's important. The main point about the difference between the Joe Rogan experience or other, if I wrote that thing today, I would say the thesis would be something like the original intellectual dark web is a network of conversational podcasts done by stand-up comedians. There's a whole bunch of them now, and they're quite popular. The point, but they all, not all, but many of them derive their approach from the Rogan podcast, and the approach is these are two people sitting across each other. The conversation has no structure necessarily. It can go, he might have a physicist on, but they're gonna talk about hunting and psychedelics and whatever else comes, just random topics that might pop up. And it's in Rogan's case, which I think is also important, they're long. So because of that, even if you did want to only talk about things that are relevant to this person's work, you can't do that for 3.5 hours. You're gonna go on weird tangents. And so when you
actually last 3.5 hours, I listened to one that was like a couple of hours, but
they alternate. I think the shortest he did was like an hour and a little bit because the guest couldn't stay longer, but 3.5 are pretty normal. Pretty common.
That's intense. So yeah, so I get the texture of it. It is loosely conversational, and I think one reason it's good is he seems to be following his enthusiasms. He seems genuinely curious.
Right.
He shows respect for the guests. I mean, you don't have guests on that you disrespect as a rule, I guess. But so he's engaged. He seems genuinely enthusiastic.
It is basically a personal conversation. This is how he would talk to this person if cameras would not be running or close to that. And he invites people who he would want to talk to. He don't necessarily agrees with them. He don't necessarily, support them or whatever. But he's having an actual personal conversation. And maybe like the metric for that could be, it's like, this is how I treat conversations just in private life too. A real conversation is when it can change both participants, right? I can say something that will influence the way you think about things, and you can say something that will influence my way of looking at things. And that's the kind of conversations that he has. So that's.
Yes, I haven't seen him have a transformation of views. But then again, I haven't seen that much.
He has definitely. That actually is very obviously noticeable if you listen to him long enough. That's like he will have a comedian after he talks to Peterson, and he will repeat something that Peterson says and go like, I don't totally understand it, but I think he said it's something like that. And so there's a definite transition of a whole bunch of different ideas in his own biography. And that's the important part. So the way McLuhan factors into all of this, he was not talking about the internet. There was no internet when he was working. But he saw in television, radio, telegraph, and so forth, the electric media, a kind of promise of a change in the paradigm. So his thought was that when the phonetic alphabet was invented, and then later on when the printing press was invented, that was a drastic change in the way people just interact with their own reality, the way they perceive reality. And he goes like, it gets weird. I'm not totally like buying all of his conclusions, though I think most of them are at least, peculiar and interesting enough to contemplate. There's like a trippy quality to them. But his view was that the reality in which a pre-literate society lived, and the reality in which the society of the book, let's say, after the Gutenberg Revolution lives, is different in all of these ways. And he would call the first one an acoustic reality, and the second one, I don't know what, visual reality. I'm going to go on.
TV, if print is a visual reality.
TV is weirdly, so this is one of those like weird, I don't totally get myself. TV, weirdly enough, is not visual, but as the way McLuhan sees it. There's somehow, I'm not going to be able to explain how TV is not visual. Somehow it's acoustic. Apparently, like you see, because it's dots that your eye actually perceives.
Well, I mean, there is sound. I can see him calling it acoustic.
There is sound, but there's like a weirder part to the explanation where it's like there's somehow the participation of the viewer is important here as well. And he thinks that the viewer participates with television because what you're actually perceiving are dots on a screen. And so in order to create a picture, your brain does that work. Anyway, that's not, I'm not gonna succeed in trying to.
Okay, I won't take you off track, but I don't get. I mean, let me just say one reason I'm skeptical of McLuhan is it seems to me he completely overlooks features of media. Media matters, but I think he completely overlooks the features of media that have huge explanatory power. And help explain why given media may be favorable to Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan or anybody else. Now, it could be that the things he is focusing on are not incompatible with the things I would focus on.
Mm-hmm.
But just to give you a sense of the things I would focus on, it's like when you move from... when you move from like cuneiform or some other ideographic system where it's like kind of pictures, it's not really phonetic. I don't think cuneiform ever became phonetic. To phonetic alphabet, to printing press, McLuhan has a way of viewing that, right? He distinguishes between those and says the distinctions matter in terms of the effect the thing has. But it seems to me like the biggest, well, for purpose of explaining the things I'm interested in, the biggest difference among those things was the degree to which they were amenable to elite control. Okay? Cuneiform ideographic systems in the ancient world were only even legible to an elite priesthood. There were like these scribes that worked with the priests or whatever, or whoever ran the system. So anything written was written by the people ruling you, and in fact was possibly intelligible only to them. Now, with a phonetics may make it a little easier, but the fact is that on the eve of the printing press, it was still a matter of hand transcribing things to create manuscripts. So the Catholic Church could pretty much control the dissemination of information. And the government could control the decision of laws, and sometimes the church and the government were the same. But the point is, the most significant thing about the printing press is that this monk nobody, few people had heard of, wrote down these things that had an audience. It's like Jordan Peterson. Okay, well, let me finish. So he writes these things up, and it's easy, and if there's a market for them, then printers will take it upon themselves to print it. He didn't have to print it. It was entrepreneurial German printers who circulated the ideas of Martin Luther. So A, it was within his power to circulate his ideas even though he was not an accepted member of the Catholic hierarchy. B, he didn't even have to do the work because there was a market for it. Now here we get to Jordan Peterson. If you ask, why might we not have heard of Jordan Peterson if we were still had three TV channels? Like I just saw this special about Mr. Rogers, this documentary about Mr. Rogers playing in theaters. Well, back when he started, 1968, 3 commercial networks and PBS. That was it on TV. Radio stations were also very finite in selection. You might have 12 local stations to choose from. That was it. If you ask why might we not have heard of Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan in that system, and why might not Donald Trump be president? McLuhan, you have a McLuhan-esque answer. I think a far more important part of the story is just the extent to which these things are amenable to elite control. Anybody can start a podcast. Nobody could start a TV show in the 60s.
Yeah.
If anybody as widely disliked by elites as Donald Trump would never show up on TV in the 60s. And so I think one important thing that I talk about this in Non-Zero, in my book Non-Zero, is that, in the early part of the book about early history, I talk about this decentralizing effect with print, and then I say what's important about video now is it's undergoing the same transition. And so you can have like these terrorist leaders doing their inspirational videos. I wrote this piece for Wired like 15 years ago anticipating this. And, because it's out of the control of the ruling class. So I think that is by far the most important thing. Now, that's not to say that the media don't have different properties.
So I think
a lot of different kinds of properties. Like as Jordan Peterson has pointed out, a podcast you can imbibe while you're doing other stuff, while you're taking a walk, you're getting exercise. It's harder to do that with print.
Right. So I think these two things go together. I totally agree with what you're saying. This is very important. Peterson did say he did in that recent. I listened to his conversation with the most recent conversation with Rogan. He did say that he views his own success as a result of this new technology. He's an early adopter of this new technology, and he did point out that it's important. So the way he says it is podcasting and YouTube did to the spoken word what the Gutenberg press did for the written word. And
correct.
One thing that you just said, he mentioned as well, you can use it in found time, so you can do the dishes and still listen it. The other thing that he pointed out is it might be that more people are just able to perceive information in words than in auditory form than in written. Like it might be just more difficult to read a book than to listen to somebody talk. What McLuhan would say that apart from these things, there are inherent differences in the, like if you, Peterson wrote that first book of his, a while ago and did not become a success or a bestseller. And I think part of the reason for that is his message better suits, like he's a better speaker, orator, an engaging speaker than he is a writer. I think. I haven't actually read a whole lot of his, but still.
Some people are the opposite, but yeah.
But there are differences. Speaker. There are differences in what print and spoken word does, and here's what McLuhan would say: the world of a preliterate man was acoustic because that's how you get your information. That's how you get your news. A real person talks to you, and everything they say has an emotional component to it. There's a cadence to how they speak. It's a personal. You can't when you read a newspaper. These are just black letters on white background, and the phonetic alphabet. The change that McLuhan will point with when from the pictorial thing you went to the phonetic alphabet is letters don't mean anything individually. there are like these degrees of detachment when you perceive information from a newspaper. Is this you feel like you're just getting the cold facts, even if you're not reading the most.
Yeah, although I mean, I would say that with phonetic writing, you're always getting a word exactly as it would be spoken.
True.
Sometimes ideographs are ambiguous. A word, the ideograph. Let's say in some ideographic system, it's a picture of a house, and it could mean either house or home. I don't know if that's the case in any such systems, but sometimes it is. So, anyway, that's a digression. But my point is that in that event, phonetic writing might be better at evoking emotions because it's like the exact word someone would say to you in the acoustic world. In other words, when you're writing, you can determine which word is going to pop into their head because it's the word you write. Whereas if you write in ideographs, you can't be sure which word will pop in their head always. But anyway.
That's true. I think he would probably say that imagery itself, like when you perceive the world, I don't know how that would parse with the acoustic world or what, but imagery itself, when you think in images, it's a stark thing that interacts with you and engages you more.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of get what you're saying about him. What I would say, though, is that there are certainly differences, to take the most obvious difference, between writing phonetically and speaking. They're very different media. That doesn't mean you can't evoke with writing the reactions and emotions you evoke with speaking. It means you have to maybe work harder at it, but in any event, do it in a different way. It's not the same. Some of the words are the words you would want to use, but sometimes you transcribe. It's like Trump's a good example.
Exactly.
You read transcriptions of what he said. It's like, what is this gibberish? Usually, when you watch him, you can at least figure out what he means. And so there are these differences, but it's like. I think they mainly amount to meaning that some people are more effective at speaking and some at writing, and that the challenges of spoken communication are different from the challenges of written communication. I mean, more than they are comments on the inherent limitations of the medium.
So, well, let me try to tie this all together. So, here's the McLuhan, one of his most popularly repeated ideas. The invention of electric media recreates the world in the image of a global village. We're getting back to that acoustic world of the proliterate man because we're getting information more through what he would call, I guess, acoustic media. We can, for the purpose of our conversation, we can focus on podcasting and YouTube. These qualities that I try to just parse out the differences between spoken word and written word. Another example. He talked about the war in Vietnam as something like the reason it got such a response in the age of television is because it's very different to read a newspaper about a number of casualties.
Oh yeah, that's for sure.
And seeing all this imagery and being engaged with this.
That's true.
So
although pictures, static pictures can carry a big punch. And one of the big differences between Vietnam and World War II is the extent to which there was censorship, either self-censorship or top-down censorship. But anyway.
Yeah, and I guess now we're back to that, right? Aren't there rules for not showing whatever corpses or coffins or something on television?
Oh, I don't think so. I don't think there's government. TV is less regulated by government than it used to be. But I don't know. But I was talking about how the military handles the challenge of what part of the war gets back to the people. That was Vietnam and World War II were different in that respect. But yeah, no, visual, like seeing, seeing a dead body is different from reading about one for sure.
No. Well, so anyway, McLuhan idea. The new electric media recreates the world in the image of a global village. We are finding ourselves in an environment that's similar to that of the proliterate men, and it carries with it all of these changes. So information becomes more personal, you're more engaged with it. The things that I tried to explain again, there's a cadence to how you perceive the information. It's more engaging. It's more like you're engaged on a personal level with it. You're less detached out of it. He would also, this is again one of these, he made many of these connections that I would not make, and I don't know if it rationally makes sense what he says, but I think he has an idea that because the letters in the printing press are interchangeable and are the same, like every A is like every other A, that prepares ground for an idea of democracy where everybody's vote is like everybody else's vote.
Yeah, I would be very dismissive of that theory myself, but as I understand it.
I think, so my take on that is I think he's operating with these kind of metaphors, and it's almost like poetry or something.
Right.
He's trying to get at something that's not rational but invokes a certain way of looking at things. But whatever. So the difference between, so if we're getting back to a state of mind and a state of interacting with the world similar to that hunter-gatherers had in a village, where everything is
talking about like TV, like visual media, what we would call visual media.
Yeah, well, I would want to focus most on our current situation where we're trying to figure out how YouTube and podcasting changes the game. And I think, again, the Rogan podcast is a perfect example of like his personality and his approach to this matching that nature of the medium. Exactly. Like he wants it to be personal. These are personal conversations. He's developing relationships with, if a person comes to the show, more than once, 2 years later, they talk as friends because they have become friends. They've influenced each other's life. He probably will get somebody to do psychedelics or use his flotation tank or whatever. He gives people pieces of meat that he kills himself. You, as a listener, and podcasting as well, by the way, I think especially long-form podcasting, it includes the listeners. It's kind of like you're, in a village. What is the media in the village? You're talking to people. You're sitting around a campfire, and somebody's telling a story, and somebody's talking to each other, and somebody's listening. When you're listening to a long conversation with headphones in your ears, these voices become literally the voices in your heads. You're there, you're witnessing that conversation as if you're a part of that conversation. If you listen to a podcast like that for a long enough time, not only you notice the changes in the relationships of these people, you develop a kind of relationship to various people who have been on the show. Now, they also have their own shows. You might get into one of those. And so it becomes a little like your social circle. You've never met any of these people, but like, especially with somebody like Joe Rogan, who just has this incredible amount of output and this very broad range of who he talks to.
How often does this show come on?
He does like 3 or 4 a week, and they last 2-3 hours each. And
well, if it was all you were doing, that would be doable, but not if you're doing anything else professionally.
He's doing a lot of other things too. He's a freak in that sense. But again, my point. So you develop a kind of relationship with all these different people, and that's increasingly how people get their information. That's like he and the people who appear on the show, who include that, IDW group.
Yeah.
Become your sources of, to some extent, facts, to a larger extent, interpretation of the facts, but hey, they're not separated in this dynamic. So you're getting a very personalized view of the world that's defined by these people, and they are way more human, way more like three-dimensional than they are if they appeared on a talk show on television.
Yeah,
that
I
they
mean,
have.
I think that accounts for a lot of the appeal. I mean, I would say, I don't think that we can say that explains the tremendous influence of podcasts, because there's a ton of different kinds of podcasts. I mean, Slate has started a whole apparently successful network of podcasts, Panoply, and their philosophy is in some ways the opposite. And I've talked to them about it. They want it tight. They want it short. They think like you're really pushing your luck if it goes over 30 minutes. They like either edited or kind of scripted in terms of the questions, like kind of bang, bang, bang. Not all of these rules. I mean, some of the things they do are more casual conversation, like the Slate Gab Fest, which predated the Panoply Network. But the point is, there's a lot of podcasts that are influential that are very different from this model. So, I mean, I don't know what McLuhan would have to say about them, since the medium is the same, except maybe in some cases one is edited, one's not.
He would say that.
I think the differences within the podcast medium are vast and significant. But I think you've pointed to some very significant aspects of Joe Rogan's appeal that are not functions of it being a podcast per se. They're functions of him deciding to make it 3 hours very conversational, have people he likes, be very engaged, and have repeat people, and so on.
Right. So there are two parts to it. One, what would McLuhan say? And two, if we forget about McLuhan for a second and just try to figure out the practical dimensions of this whole thing. The first thing, McLuhan would say the medium is the message. That's his idea, right? The difference between the different shows on television is less significant than the difference between TV and a book or something. So he would, I think, would say that those qualities that the Joe Rogan Experience has as a show, the same qualities have, the medium itself has those qualities. It's more personal, more engaged, etc. Even if the particular show you're listening to tries to be not as, evoking of a conversation around a campfire in a village, it still is closer to that than if you read the same thing in a newspaper.
Can be. I mean, again, there are people who had followings. It's like, I don't know why Irma Bombeck springs to mind, but she was an American columnist. She was read by a large demographic category known as housewives. And and she's very casual and personal, and you were like her friend. You would never talk to her. So I don't know. I mean, I'm gonna go to bed tonight the way I woke up this morning, a McLuhan skeptic.
Okay. Well, let me move on to the second part then.
Okay, better hurry. I've got a what is this? It would be a podcast. It's kind of a cross between it's less on the Joe Rogan end of the spectrum, but I've got to go get my exercise and then come back and do it.
Okay. So let me try to do this quick. Even if we forget about McLuhan for a second, I think what Joe Rogan is doing is important, influential. He has created this whole wave of other podcasts that go into that same direction. They all have different takes on it, but it's all the same, less structure, more personal approach.
What are the biggest ones? I mean, Sam Harris is kind of like that.
Kind of like that, but...
What's the name of that guy, the British guy with the long hair?
Russell Brand.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did. I think he started precisely because of Rogan, like directly. There is like at least a dozen of stand-up comedians that I could name who have podcasts like that. And then there are, just of the things that I'm aware of, I think there is a little bit of because Rogan is big on martial arts, there are some things that sprung around that topic. Chris Ryan, the guy who wrote Sex at Dawn,
I had him on my show long ago. Does he have a big podcast now?
I don't know how big it is because it's a podcast. You can look up the numbers.
When it gets big, he should have me on. because I had
I
him on.
Yeah, I actually would be good. I actually like his podcast, and he again is. I haven't read his book, but I get it that it's like most people who know anything about what he wrote
It has not
about
been
are pretty
received well in
dismissive.
evolutionary psychology circles.
And when you listen to him even talk about the same ideas, you kind of get, well, that's because you wrote it. You weren't supposed to write the book. You were supposed to record the podcast. You're just talking about whatever comes to your mind. It's like, maybe it was like that. Who fucking knows? I like entertaining these kinds of ideas.
Yeah,
and he doesn't come across arrogant in audio, because you hear, oh, that's that guy who likes talking about
right.
All kinds of shit.
Right.
Anyway, so Rogan has created this. He created his own show that has all these qualities we talked about. He sprung all of these other shows like that. The connection between those shows are, again, personal. These are people who go to each other podcasts. They have like a little community, which makes the listener of these podcasts relate to them in that kind of way too. And I think, and Peterson is like that too. He's not conversational
No, he's not. It's always about him when he's involved in a conversation. With Joe Rogan, it's the opposite.
Right.
Joe Rogan has a podcast where you interview people. Jordan Peterson doesn't, but I don't know that Jordan Peterson would be able to have a good version of that. He does have his message, and he's going to get it out.
He does have interviews on his YouTube channel, and I don't think those are good. You can see that he doesn't play that role well. But as monologues go, he's really good at engaging people.
He's very good.
And partly because of all of these qualities of spoken word. He's emotional. He brings up a bunch of different stories into the narrative, etc.
Well, and he speaks with a self-assurance that just kind of half convinces you he's right.
True,
I mean,
true.
It's like, it's almost the opposite of what you're saying about Chris Ryan, where there can be virtue in going, well, this is just my opinion, blah, blah, blah. I've never heard Jordan Peterson say this is just my opinion. This is God's truth, because I said it.
So how does that relate to the IDW? I think to me, it seems that within that group, there are people, Rogan and Peterson are two people who don't need the IDW. They're immensely successful as they are now. They can carry on doing what they're doing.
This is the intellectual dark web, by the way, if this ever sees the light of day and people don't know what IDW means.
Right.
I'm not sure I may have said that, but they can Google it.
And then there are other people like Ben Shapiro and what's his name?
Dave Rubin.
Right. Who have a political message, like more political than what Peterson is doing, more straightforwardly, traditionally, easily to be seen on television, not maybe right now in the state the American media is now, but they could have had
They could
TV
do Fox
shows.
News talking points.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And so for them, the idea of having this project IDW as a network of these people with this image of we can talk about we entertain all kinds of ideas and talk to all kinds of people, that is like they are trying to use what Rogan and those stand-up comedians and Chris Ryan and these, I think, what's his name, Joko something, the military guy has a podcast. So there are all kinds of different kinds of people who actually do that, and what was the word? The character of what a stand-up comedian is speaks to that very, like, a stand-up comedian is supposed to be funny. You're supposed to be engaging. Then if you start talking to other people, you can talk to whoever. You don't have to have an ideological angle. In fact, it might hurt you if you're not open-minded enough. So I guess my thesis is this thing that Rogan started will influence the way we get information, is already influencing the way we get information, the way people interact with political ideas as well as all other kinds of ideas. And the IDW is kind of an attempt to mimic that, but a more artificial one. And I don't know how it's going to go with the IDW, whether it's going to be a success or not. Peterson and Rogan, I think, are safely, like, they have their audiences and they are developing that kind of relationship. Rogan is doing that with others in that group too. But it's, Peterson also, I just yesterday I realized something I hadn't been noticing before. He's been on 4 of these stand-up comedians conversational podcasts himself, Peterson. And so he's becoming, and if you listen to those, again, you have this personal interaction, like the most recent one he did with Theo Vaughn. He's a stand-up comedian. He's originally, I think, from like small town in Louisiana and had addiction problems. And so his personality in combination with Peterson leads easily to this almost like, I think he actually said it, Theo Vaughn said that he thinks that Peterson is perceived by all of these, especially young men, as a kind of like stepfather who actually cares about our mom. There's this father-son kind of dynamic. And that, again, works very well with Peterson, with what he naturally is. And you'll have, if he continues doing this kind of broad circle of podcasts of this kind of conversational nature, the audience of those podcasts will further develop a kind of personal relationship to him and to his message that will continue to grow his appeal and his influence.
Well, I guess I gotta go, but I would say, some aspects of what you're talking about, a lot of podcasts try to cultivate, like a sense of like, hey, I'm a member, I'm involved in this personally, like Slate's Culture Gabfest or their Gabfest. It's like same cast of characters kind of, and like you come to know them. Mm-hmm. They do their casual asides. They do some personal references. Even Trumpcast, more edited and scripted, it has, first of all, a coherent ideology. So it's like a family of belief, and, but all that said, clearly Joe Rogan is adding a new degree to the personal dimension. The fact that the structure is so conversational, and it could go anywhere. They could wind up confiding something they've never said before in public, right?
Yes.
That's the idea. And
you are now eligible for rates as low as 0%. Congratulations.
Congratulations, Nikita.
5 times faster and take advantage of this offer.
Okay, thank you.
What am I eligible now?
What?
What am I eligible for now?
I think it's a low interest loan.
Oh, nice.
That's the other thing we fought Vietnam for, so we could have those. But so I think that's true. None of it tells me I'm McLuhan, but I think it's worth doing the exegesis on what makes, but there's also, to some extent, just the power of his persona. He's got this authentic history. He was like a martial arts guy or something? What?
Martial arts and stand-up comedy are the two big components.
And,
but then also all kinds of
I'm
other
sure,
shit.
And then...
that actually is one last piece that I would like to add to the puzzle. I think, again, McLuhan would say that the world of the original village and the global village is more integral. There's a less of what do we call it? Experts are just going to become less kind of possible or popular or whatever. They're going to be are less in control of what's going on. People who have one niche and are really good in that one their power is going to diminish. And people like Rogan, who can talk about a million different topics, their power is gonna increase. And Peterson, once again,
although at the same time, more and more obscure experts have some podcasts they can show up on for one episode, right? I mean,
true, yeah.
They have a place in the ecosystem. I'd have to think about that claim of McLuhan's. But I should go. I got to swim in podcast.